So any quick comments or questions? I do want to look at the chat. I see an early comment here about pedophilia in medieval Spain and Spanish poetry. Well, look, the age of consent is a relatively modern concept. Jews in North Africa also were known for taking child brides, as was the non-Jewish population. I mean, this was not unusual. Don't forget that even Romeo and Juliet is, I think, like 13 or 14 in that story. I mean, this is unfortunately the way that that things worked back then. Not to excuse it, of course. And so the models of poetry were also part of that. Also, keep in mind they're modeling it at least a little bit on Greek literature. And if you read Greek philosophy, the idea of the man-boy partnership, both intellectual and physical, is part of the Symposium by Plato and part of other examples of philosophical cultural literature in Greece. And it wasn't necessarily gay affirmative, because they didn't, that was sort of a phase. You go through that phase of education and then you move on to marry a woman, and then if that was the assumption. But it's still interesting that that finds its reflections in this literature and poetry. There are examples, I will say, of poetry in Hebrew from this period where a man is expressing love for another man. You can tell by the grammar. Now, is this sort of platonic love? Is this brotherly love? Is this comradely love? Or is this what we might think of as same-sex attraction love? It's hard to draw a strict line on that, even in that period, let alone now. Okay, so other comments or questions? Yeah, Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, the concept of hidden Jew really kind of hits home with us. My daughter-in-law, Carla, she was born in the United States, but her parents were from Nicaragua. And she and some of her cousins hired a genealogist. This genealogist did a research, the thickness of the New York phone book, if anybody remembers a phone book. And it turns out that Spain had a program in the past few years, it just ended last year, that if you can prove your lineage back to the Jewish lineage, back to the Inquisition, they will grant you Spanish citizenship.
Right.
So they hired the genealogist, proved their Spanish citizenship. Since Spanish is Carla's first language, they also required a Spanish proficiency test, which was not a problem, and a Spanish citizenship test, which he was about to take last March when COVID hit. But there is one synagogue in, I think it's Arizona or New Mexico, that is processing this whole thing for Spain. And so you need to send all your paperwork and everything else through this synagogue. And potentially she and my grandchildren might have EU citizenship.
Great. And there are still sizable active Ladino-speaking Sephardic communities in, there's a sizable group in Washington State, I think in Seattle. There are some in New York City. Again, one of the earliest synagogues in the country is the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York, which again is founded by that community. Again, not as many in Salonika these days because post-Holocaust, Greece was occupied by the Germans and had its native fascist population as well. And most of the Jews of Salonika were deported to Auschwitz, and only about 2,000 of them made it back after the war. So that community was mostly destroyed. There are still some Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews in Istanbul as well, though many of them are older and have left. And there are some in Israel too. But it's an interesting community in its history. And again, those converso roots go deep. A lot of people, feel an affinity to Jewish culture and wonder if it's part of their genetics, or they take a Ancestry.com or 23andMe test and it shows Iberian ancestry. And what does that mean? And it shows Hebrew ancestry and they want to explore it. Our approach, being open to people choosing to be Jewish, is very welcoming for those kind of communities. We don't have to show an unbroken line of matrilineal descent to prove connection to the Jewish people. And I think that's an asset for people exploring that background. But it's almost impossible to tell in some cases whether it's genuine or not. Like if you there are lots of Jewish heritage tours of Spain, and they'll do things like, you see that hole in the doorpost there? That was where a mezuzah was. Ooh, well, okay. Or maybe someone chipped something out of the doorpost. I mean, it can get a little bit overdone. And so, because there's a market there. Again, if someone comes to me with that background, it's fascinating for them to explore their heritage. And if they want to maintain or explore Jewish connection now, even better. The more the merrier. Okay. First, what were some of the keys to the Jewish Golden Age in medieval Spain? And are any of these in common with the modern Jewish experience? So as we talked about last time and today, being well integrated into the large Arab empire, both politically and economically, was a real asset. There was a very creative intellectual and cultural exchange with the surrounding cultures, and also a marked emphasis on not just cultural creativity, but interest in this worldly life, what we might call the secular world. And so I find a lot of interesting parallels to the modern Jewish experience, even though our secular society is even more secular and even more friendly to Jews in general. I don't want to say that the Golden Age was a farce and was a lie of those 19th century historians. It was true. It was a successful and very culturally creative and fruitful period for Jewish life. And as we said, you can't live history backwards. You always have to look at it forwards and not just look at the end of the story. Same is true for the Jews in Spain. The Jews living in 800, 900, 1,000, they were living the good life. And the fact that it would end from the 1200s to the 1400s through 1492, well, that was still a couple of centuries ahead. I mean, the American Jewish experience is only 200 or so years old. Who knows where it's going to go from here, either up or maybe even down. Any other thoughts on that? Keys to the Jewish Golden Age? Responses? You can feel free to unmute yourself.
I just wanted to say that I think it reflects in some ways the more modern period in the integration of Jews in the life of the Muslim Spain. And then so you have the beginnings of the Enlightenment period of German Jews and such trying to integrate and starting to get more German names and speaking German and integrating into the culture. There is a little bit, there's a little bit of a difference in the way Islam looks at the Jews, but I think that there are some similarities there, and in how Jewish life flourishes during that time period, as it does in Germany, for example, in the 19th century.
Right. Who are some of the most famous Jews from medieval Sepharad? What were their accomplishments? How relevant are they to secular humanistic Jews? So we talked about Maimonides, writing a code of Jewish law and writing a book of Jewish philosophy, trying to explain how you can have your God and your Aristotle too. Serves as a physician to an Arab ruler and a community leader, answering rabbinic questions. You've got Judah Halevi, who's a major poet on both secular and religious topics, also writing philosophy. You've got Chasta ibn Shaprut, who's the court vizier and the Arabic linguist or translator of scientific material, and other examples like that. So how relevant would you say that those examples are to our experience?
Well, I think in the case of Maimonides, I think he's sort of an example of one of the steps on the gradual abstraction of the God concept until it essentially finally disappears into nothingness. That you see a lot, that there's this very very, what I'd say is the word, not abstract God with the hands. It's almost like a really powerful superhero kind of person. And then as you learn more about the world, well, you don't necessarily need the same kind of explanations for natural phenomena. And so it's almost a God of the gaps thing, where you push the God into more and more abstract, less hands-on kind of roles, until finally you get to the point where you either have, it's a metaphor for the universe as a whole, or you go full on humanistic Judaism and go, okay, yeah, no, there is no God.
Well, I was just going to say, there's some debate over whether Maimonides was actually a secular thinker or not. Was he going as far as he could go, given the time and the place. And he really believed something deeper and even more scandalous that he couldn't even put into writing in Judeo-Arabic. I think that's a bit of wishful thinking, sort of projecting back what we would want him to be. But certainly he's a trend in the direction of trying to harmonize secular knowledge and the Jewish experience, and willing to change some of the Jewish ideas to fit, harmonizing like what Chabad or Aish HaTorah does, trying to make science agree with the rabbinic literature, is not what Maimonides was doing, because they know the conclusions. They know what they wanted to say at the end, and they're just going to make it say that. Where Maimonides was willing to shift a little bit here and there in different ways.
See, this is why you're the rabbi. You explain it so much better than I did.
Well, the other reality is that there's sort of multiple versions of Maimonides, because if you read the Maimonides of the Mishnah Torah, that code of law written in Hebrew for a broader audience, you get to some conclusions. But you read the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, and he sort of undermines some of the claims he makes in the popular book. So the joke is that there's maybe multiple Maimonides. You have your Maimonides, I have my Maimonides. Okay. One other example like that I'll mention is a commentator on the Hebrew Bible named Moses Ibn Ezra. Again, you can hear the Arabic influence, Ibn Ezra, who writes a very sort of straightforward, this is what the Torah means commentary, not a lot of mysticism, very sort of straightforward, what's called Peshat, or on the surface level commentary. But at one point at the end of Deuteronomy, he comes up to the line and looks over it, but doesn't quite cross it. So he points out that there's an oddity here at the end of the Torah, because it describes Moses dying and what happens after Moses' death. And it says Moses was the greatest prophet who ever lived. And why would the humblest man who ever lived, which Moses is said to be, would say he was the greatest prophet? Why would he do that? And then he says, Ibn Ezra writes, Misha Yavin Yavin, whoever understands will understand. Meaning, that's as much as I can say. So I can raise the issue here that maybe these last few verses might not have been written by Moses, but I can't say that. So I'm just going to get you to that point, and then Misha Yavin Yavin, whoever understands will understand. Again, reflective of this questioning, skeptical, secular era in some ways. Even if they're not really secular, they're rabbis, they're living religious lives, they're writing pious poetry, but they're also willing to ask different questions. And the religious thought is interesting, but not necessarily as inspiring to us as, that poem, if fear is a rock, then I am the hammer. Whew, that's like motivating even today. And the fact that it's written in Hebrew going back 1,000 years, I think gives us a sense of pedigree with that kind of Jewish literature. How were Jewish philosophers and scientists affected by intellectual developments in Islamic culture? And what can this say about modern Jewish approaches to general knowledge? Again, we talked last time about Arab linguistics, offering insight into the Hebrew language, commentaries on the Quran, leading to Jewish commentaries on the Torah. Arabic study of Greek philosophy and Arabic translation enables Maimonides to learn Aristotle. The models of Arabic poetry being adopted into Hebrew literature, Neoplatonic thought under Arabic influencing medieval Kabbalah, mysticism, and so on. So, when we're thinking about Jewish thought today, does that provide a model for us, or do we have to have a different kind of approach? Well, I think in the end, we're even more willing to shift than they were. So if they were willing to, write Arabic style poetry in Hebrew words, now we might be willing to import non-Jewish secular philosophical ideas into Jewish ceremonies or into Jewish literature, So we're willing to push the envelope a little bit further, to say out loud what Ibn Ezra could hint at, or to follow through on some of those conclusions that Maimonides might have hinted at in Judeo-Arabic. So if he doesn't believe in a God with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, then maybe you change your Haggadah to not say with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Maimonides wouldn't have done that, but we might be willing to go a little further. Yeah, Roger.
Well, part of it, even in the golden ages there, Jews still, they were allowed to worship, but they were only allowed to work. They couldn't make the outside of the synagogue look like a ornate or a synagogue. Everything, because of their place in the Arab culture,
Right.
they were freer, but they were still, the Jewish part of their existence was still pretty suppressed.
Right.
Unlike here.
Right. I mean, I'm imagining these like, symposium where they're having drinking and poetry contests, but they're in the inner courtyard, right? They're not on the public square and they're not for general consumption. It's a very elite kind of audience. So you're right. It's a less public kind of Jewishness, where it can be more in private or in, one-on-one conversations, but in the public square, they have to conform to the dominant rules of the day. But as I mentioned last time, that Pactu Vomar, that rule of being the dhimmi, the subordinate minority that's tolerated, could be interpreted more leniently. And in the medieval Spanish experience, Jews were often able to be a little bit more sort of public and ostentatious with their power. They were able to become viziers and court physicians, where in other territories, in Iran, for example, they were more consistently oppressed and suffering and put down on. So this is, again, one of those periods of liberalization that will collapse, but when it was going very well. Questions? So what caused the decline of Sephardic Jewry up to 1492? Well, we went through this. If you remember the last 40 minutes, you'll remember it. You have the Christian reconquest in the 1100s, where the Jews begin to flee south, but then you have the Almohad Berber Muslims invading in the 1200s, so the Jews flee back north into Christian Spain. Then you have anti-Jewish riots in 1391, leading to disputations for explicit Jews and the persecution of these conversos by the Inquisition. Ultimately, the conquest of Granada in 1492 enables the Christian monarchs to expel all the non-Christians from Spain, and the loss of the greater markets of the Arabic Empire and the religious fanaticism on all sides doesn't augur well for Jewish survival and thriving. Number 5, the complicated results of the Inquisition, the Moranos, Conversos, new and old Christians, and returning to Judaism in the diaspora. Again, we talked about that a little bit earlier in our session. The Moranos is the epithet applied to Conversos, people who converted but maintained a secret Judaism. There's a famous story of Jews hiding a mezuzah in the foot of a Madonna statue in a particular church, so that when they walk into the church, they're kissing the foot of the Madonna, like other good Catholics, but for the Jews, they're actually kissing the mezuzah. And that's one way of maintaining that kind of secret Jewish identity. There's actually a book called The Mezuzah and the Madonna's Foot that talks more about that kind of example. But even the conversos who were sincere converts were still considered by the old Christians as new Christians, recent Christians who were suspect and maybe needed to prove a pedigree, that limpieza de sangre concept. And some of the Jews did try to maintain a crypto-Jewish identity and tried to flee, and did manage to get out into other communities and were able to come out of their hidden identity. When they did so, by the way, sometimes it was a problem because they would come to the Jewish community and they would say, "Take us back as Jews." And the Jewish community had to make a decision because technically they had transgressed a rule you weren't supposed to break. So according to rabbinic thought, you can break any of the commandments to save your life. It says you should live by these commandments and not die by them. So if someone says, "Eat this pork or I'm going to kill you," you can eat the pork. If you're starving to death, you can eat non-kosher. You can save your life and break any commandments except for 3. There are 3 commandments you're not allowed to break to save your life. One of them is you're not allowed to break the commandment against murder. So, I couldn't hold a gun to Lori's head and say, "You need to kill Rin," and Lori doesn't. It doesn't work. There's no excuse, because the rabbinic phrase, I love the phrasing, is, who's to say his blood is redder? Who's to say that your life is worth more than that person? You don't get to choose. So you can't break murder to save a life. You cannot commit impure sexual practices, incest, adultery, those kind of things. You should die rather than do them. And the third one, murder, sexual practices, and idolatry. You should not commit idolatry to save your life. If they say, "Bow down to this statue or I'm going to kill you," you do what's called Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name, and you allow yourself to be killed. Well, if you were a medieval Jew and you looked at a Catholic church, what does that look like to you? I see a lot of statues or idols. I see a lot of people bowing and kissing to these statues and idols here. And if you submitted to converting to that, and now you're saying you want to come back, you blew it. You had one job, right? You had your chance and you blew it. But in the end, how long are you going to hold a grudge? Can you really keep them out forever? In the end, most communities grudgingly over time manage to accept them back. And we saw the example of the case in Recife, where sometimes it was dangerous to come out because you're admitting that you had lied and fortunes of war could change, and then you're stuck under the Inquisition one more time. And the last question is just basically the poetry of Yehuda Halevi. How does it demonstrate examples of focus on this worldly life? As we saw, focus on love, aging, friendship, death, wine, that's all this worldly stuff. But he also includes poetry written with divine praise and petition. So then the question is, can secular humanistic Jews comfortably use his work and say this is secular Jewish poetry if he himself wasn't a secular Jew? Is that kosher, so to speak, for us to use it?
Well, that goes to semantics, though, doesn't it? Well, but I think, we use quotes from like the Song of Songs and stuff. So I don't see that there's any like real difference in that. It's Jewish cultural artifacts. So, and it really, it goes to how are you defining secular? Are you saying that the person was secular, or are you saying the work is secular?
Okay. I don't know how many of you have ever quoted Martin Luther King Jr. He gave a lot of Christian sermons. He was a minister, but he could still have inspiring words that apply to everybody. It doesn't mean that, in citing someone, you're citing everything they've done or everything they believe. You're citing the message they have on this particular issue, and you find it motivational, inspirational, or otherwise. So I wanted to end with a story about a disputation that has a somewhat happy ending. So the rabbi in this particular Spanish town is called up by the local ruler, who says, we're going to have a disputation in the central arena, you and a priest. And on this, the future of the Jewish community in this town depends. So the priest and the rabbi go into the arena, but of course this is before microphones, so the people can only see what they're doing. They can't really hear what they're saying. And so first, the priest holds up one finger. The rabbi thinks for a moment and then holds up three fingers. And the priest is dumbfounded. What an eloquent argument. How could the rabbi have seen through his position so clearly? And so then the priest, having thought for a moment, waves his hand like this in the air. And the rabbi thinks in response and points down to the ground. And again, the priest has no rebuttal. The rabbi has simply confounded him. And so finally he has a brilliant idea. He pulls out a communion wafer and puts it in his mouth. And the rabbi removes an apple and takes a bite. And the priest surrenders. He says, I've lost. The argument's over. Forget it. They get to stay. So each of the clergy go back to their communities and they're sort of debriefing what happened. And the priest says, this rabbi is quite a genius. So I began my argument by saying, we believe in the one true God and have the one true interpretation of his word. And he responded to me, but do you not believe in three gods, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? And I had to concede. He has a point there in our Trinitarian understanding. So then I said, our God is the God of all the heavens. But he responded, but we are living here on earth and have to make our best understanding of that world. And he's right. Maybe we have a partial understanding of all the universe. We are not God. We are living here on earth. And so then I brought out the communion wafer, the symbol of Christ's gift of his body and his life to save humanity. But he pulled out the apple, reminding us that all of us are equally sinners, descended from Adam and Eve. And so, who is one sinner to cast a stone at another? And so I conceded. Now, when the rabbi went back to the Jewish community, he had a somewhat different interpretation of the argument. So the rabbi said, well, he told me, you got to leave in 1 day. I said, well, we're going to take at least 3 days. And he said, you're going to round up and get out of here. And I said, no, we're going to stay right here. And then we broke for lunch. So maybe sometimes the disputation can have a happy ending.